All right. So last week we studied up through around verse 21 and 22 of Acts chapter 22. We have been studying how that Paul has come to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey. He's come to Jerusalem knowing full well that the Spirit has been revealing to him first of all, through the persecutions he's faced elsewhere, as well as the prophecy from Agabus, as well as whatever may have been revealed to him personally through the Spirit. He knows that he's going to be facing imprisonment and persecution in Jerusalem. He's come to Jerusalem. He has taken a vow with these other Jewish brethren. He was in the temple on the seventh day. At the conclusion of this vow, he was taken by force out of the temple. The doors of the temple were closed, and the people started beating him because, and of course there were accusations that were inaccurate, but in addition to the fact that he teaches against Moses and against this place and against the law, against the people, he also mentioned the fact that, or the accusation was that he had taken a Gentile into the temple, which of course Paul had not done. So they were beating him. The Roman commander comes and rescues Paul, has to carry him up the stairs of Antonia, the steps of Antonia. Antonia is the garrison, the base, if you will, of the Romans in Jerusalem, which was kind of set apart from the temple, but still on the mount where they can kind of overlook what was going on. And as Paul, starting really in verse 1, he's addressing this crowd of people who had been trying to kill him. He's speaking in Hebrew, Aramaic. He's speaking to them in their own native tongue. And as he's speaking this, preaching about basically, this is what happened to me. I was just like all of you. And then I had this encounter on the road to Damascus on my way to arrest Christians. And Paul reveals all the things that took place in the dialogue between him and Jesus, what happened with Ananias in Damascus. He returns to Jerusalem, verse 17. Jesus comes and speaks to him while he's in a trance, says, "Make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me." And of course, he's been permitted to speak all through this, describing Jesus having been raised. These are people who certainly are aware of Jesus of Nazareth, and at the very least, they are familiar with the story, even if they weren't personally there. Keep in mind, it's been some 30-odd years or so since the death of Jesus. But if people who weren't there personally aren't there, their children are, okay? Or people who I'm sure are familiar with the events that took place with Jesus of Nazareth. But Paul, he's been preaching about this, teaching about Jesus, talking to him. The inference there is that he's been raised from the dead. He's speaking with the authority of God, Jesus is, as a spirit to Paul. And then verse 18, Jesus, the implication here is that the Jews are hard of hearing. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to receive your testimony about me. They're not going to listen. And so verse 19 and in verse 20, Paul acknowledged what his past was. Lord, they know in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. When the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. It's this contrast, this change in Paul's life. And Lord, they know what I used to do. And it's almost as if this was and I've often thought about Paul's response to the Lord here in verses 19 and 20. And I think the reason why Paul says this, Jesus doesn't acknowledge what Paul says so much as he tells, I want you to get out, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. It's almost as if Paul was trying to reason, hey, this is a perfect reason to be able to give them to receive my testimony. Okay, because I was one of them. And I was beating Christians, and I was there when Stephen was killed. They have every reason to listen to me, even though Jesus says they're not going to listen to you. To which Jesus responds in essence, but you're not being sent to the Jews. This is not your purpose. Your purpose is to be sent to the Gentiles. And it's at this point that the Jews come unhinged, so to speak. They refuse to listen any longer. I mean, they can, I guess, tolerate Paul describing Jesus of Nazareth, the fact that he is speaking from heaven and so forth. But then when he says that God, through Jesus of Nazareth, directs Paul to not preach to his own people, but rather to people who aren't the, quote, people of God, that's where they drew the line. And so we see in verse 22, they listened to him up until this word, then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live." And then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that they might know why they shouted so against him. This wasn't just a casual response from the Jews. If it weren't such a serious event, one would almost describe this as a tantrum. Okay, kind of how you picture children, and they start stomping their feet and doing crazy stuff. They're just angry and upset. But these people, there's murder in what they're saying. I mean, notice how they say he is not fit to live. They want him dead. The last time we saw the Jews in such an uproar, and we're not just talking about the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sanhedrin got all up in arms in Acts chapter 7 with Stephen. But the last time a whole group of people, a multitude of people in Jerusalem were in such upheaval was when? Christ. As far as we know, that was the last time that all of the people, or at least this multitude of people like this, were up in arms over a single individual. When Stephen was killed, that was mainly, it seems to be the Sanhedrin. Okay, that was mainly the Sanhedrin involved. They were angry. They killed Stephen by stoning. This is not, the Sanhedrin is not being described here yet. In fact, Paul isn't even before the Sanhedrin yet. He will be when the commander tries to figure out what in the world's going on. This is among the people. And of course, you have the Jews from Asia. Keep in mind that the population of Jerusalem at this point, generally speaking, on an average day, the population of Jerusalem was between 75 and 100,000 people. Some estimate a little bit more. That's a kind of a conservative mid-range estimate. But at Pentecost, it surged almost around to 300,000. It would almost triple in size from all of the Jews of the dispersion coming for Passover and up until Pentecost. So you've got a lot of people. You've got a lot of people who are somewhat confused. We saw that earlier back in chapter 21, kind of similar situation as what took place in Ephesus, in the fact that a lot of these people didn't know why they had all come together. Okay, the Asian Jews had riled everybody up because they knew Paul. Some of these Judean Jews, maybe they were hearing this and that. Remember, the commander was asking them what's going on, and the commander couldn't figure it out because everybody was saying something different. Now, they all know why they're mad. Because at the very least, what Paul's described, in addition to everything else, he's described that God has sent a message to the Gentiles in some form or fashion. At least that's what Paul is proposing that God has done. And they don't like that. Any thoughts through verse 21? And, well, technically 22. Verse 23, so they cried out, they tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air. What does the commander have potentially on his hands at this moment? A riot. Yeah, a riot. And what was the one thing Caesar wouldn't tolerate? Riots. Okay, upheaval of the people. That was one thing that the Roman government, they don't like that. Okay, do what you got to do and impose the Roman law in cases where it contradicted with the local law, but you do not tolerate riots. And so the commander has to tread very carefully in this situation. But that's, verse 23, you've got a people riled up, and not just a few, but a whole, at least several thousands of people at the least, possibly more, all there at the garrison. Okay, keep in mind, the garrison generally had around 1,000 soldiers. There could have been more during Pentecost or Passover and Pentecost simply because there were more Jews. There's no evidence that says specifically that's what Rome did in sending more soldiers. But at the very least, there was always 1,000 soldiers in Jerusalem and Antonia. But those 1,000 soldiers probably wouldn't be able to hold off, let's say, 10,000 Jews if they just decided to overrun the barracks. And keep in mind, at this point, in the 60, 64-ish AD, Okay, in that realm, give or take a few years, is when this is taking place. What's going to happen in about 10 years? Yeah, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed because political relations between the Jews and the Romans bite the dust. Okay, so you already have growing tensions between the Jews and the Romans anyway. Okay, so all this kind of political scene, climate, is kind of in the background of all of this as well, and how the commander goes about dealing with what he's doing. All right, so verse 24, the commander ordered that Paul be brought into the barracks. The garrison, Antonia, said that he should be examined under scourging so that the commander might know why they shouted so against Paul. Okay, I need to know what's going on. I can't, and the commander was there. I don't know if the commander was able to understand Aramaic or not. I would assume, being the commander. Now, some of the soldiers might not have had a need to understand Aramaic necessarily, but for the commander, I would think he would at least have to be able to understand some to be able to interact with the Jews. Okay, so he had to be able to have a basis to speak on. It's possible that those in charge, kind of between the Roman government in Jerusalem, which included the commander, and the Jewish government, which included the Sanhedrin, I'm sure they all spoke Greek. Okay, so I'm sure there was a basic language they all spoke to be able to communicate. But I don't know if the commander understood what Paul was saying or not. If he didn't understand, Paul speaking in some language he doesn't understand, all of a sudden the people just start going crazy. That's concerning. Even if he did understand what Paul was saying, he doesn't have the background in Judaism to understand why this is so offensive to the Jews. Okay, even if he did know what it was Paul said, it didn't justify the reaction, at least from an outsider's Gentile perspective. It didn't justify their reaction. And so he still doesn't understand. So either way, he's got to know what's going on. And so he's going to interrogate Paul. And this was the typical type of interrogation that included scourging from the Romans. It wasn't a pleasant interrogation. Anything through verse 24 so far?
Any other time you call that torture. But
Yeah.
that would be acceptable during history, then that was acceptable
Yeah.
way of giving information.
Well, pain has a way of producing the desired effect. Certainly, fortunately, we have laws in our country and are supposed to have laws in our world that present this type of examination, although that obviously is not always followed. All right, so verse 25. They bound him with thongs, and Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." So, remember when Paul was at the steps of Antonia, he didn't bring up his Roman citizenship because there was no place for it at that point. He simply was describing the fact that even though, because remember, the commander thought he was that Egyptian. He says, "No, I'm from Tarsus, an important city, but I was raised here, so I'm able to converse with them. I'm able to speak with them kind of on their own terms." And so the commander allowed that. But it never came up that Paul was an actual Roman citizen. Okay, keep in mind that Roman citizens were kind of the primary focus in terms of Roman government and what its laws ceded liberty. Okay, the liberty was mainly for Roman citizens. And then you had conquered or occupied peoples that were further down the scale. Okay, so the Jews weren't considered main citizens. They weren't considered citizens at all. They were not slaves or servants, but they were considered a conquered people. Okay, so Paul, as a Jew, would have no ability to appeal the decision of the commander to scourge him, first of all, much less later on appeal to Caesar. But because Paul's a Roman citizen, there are allowances within the law for the Romans to due process. And it is to that law that Paul is appealing at this point. Paul, as a Jew under Judean oversight, was subject to the law of Moses from a civil perspective. He's already shown his allegiance to that. But now this has gone beyond the law of Moses, the civil law of Moses. Now it's in the realm of the Romans, but Paul's able to also appeal under that. So when Paul says in verse 25, they bind him, okay, the thongs here is more like handcuffs. Okay, before we saw the 2 chains that he had on his feet, on his feet and on his hands. These are more like he's cuffed together completely. Okay, he can't even move at all hardly. So presumably this is just his hands. I don't know if it was common to do both his hands and his feet, because they got to move him, and otherwise they'd have to carry him everywhere. So I believe this is just his hands, probably behind his back or in front if they're preparing him for scourging. Paul brings up to the centurion. Okay, so he puts him in. So the commander puts Paul in charge of a centurion. Centurion is in charge of how many soldiers? 100. Centurion, centa. Okay, he's in charge of 100. This centurion, okay, who is a high officer. Okay, who else was a centurion that we've already known about? Cornelius. Yeah, Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 was also a centurion. I mean, he's an officer, okay, but not as high as the commander. But when Paul speaks to the centurion and says, "Is it lawful?" Does Paul know if it's lawful or not? Paul knows, okay. But he says it this way, and he says it in such a way as to provide the centurion the ability to come to an understanding of his own. I need to stop this, and we need to talk about it. Because the way he says it, Paul, is it lawful for you to scourge? No, it's not. In fact, it's unlawful. In fact, as the centurion's going to say to the commander in verse 26, we need to be very careful, because had they carried through with this, and it be found out that Paul, being a Roman citizen, was scourged without due process, there were serious ramifications for both the commander and the centurion, and any of those officers that or soldiers that would have been involved in it. They all would have been punished, and I don't think they would have just been demoted or kicked out of the army. It was probably pretty severe. I don't know for a fact that it was death, but it was, I'm sure, pretty severe punishment. You see that based on verse 26. He went and told the commander, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." And the commander, seemingly immediately, then the commander came and said to him, to Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And Paul says, "Yes." And the commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained my citizenship." He doesn't ask so much as it's almost asking without asking. The commander's curious as to how Paul came about this, given the fact that Paul was indeed a Jew. You're a Jew. Well, as a Roman, and keep in mind that part of the problem with the Roman way of doing things anyway was they incorporated conquered peoples into their armies. Okay, they just drafted a lot of their guys into their own armies. A lot of them were kind of paid like mercenaries, so to speak. So a lot of these guys weren't purebred Romans. They were simply from peoples that had been conquered. This commander, it's a pretty high accomplishment for this fellow, given the fact that he apparently wasn't born a Roman. He had to purchase his citizenship in order to be a Roman. But notice how Paul says, "I was born a citizen." There's not exact or concrete evidence necessarily that says one way or the other exactly what the specifics were, if there was a differentiation between, in terms of Roman law, into how someone was treated who purchased their citizenship versus how someone was treated who was born a citizen. But there's a whole lot of suggestion made by scholars and commentaries to say that if there wasn't by law a differentiation, there certainly was a differentiation by mindset or attitude. Someone who was born a citizen, typically they were considered purebred Roman, as opposed to someone who simply bought their way in. Similar to the Jews who were purebred Jews by Judea versus the Jews that were born of the dispersion. Okay, not necessarily maybe to that extent, and the idea that they were kind of second-class Jews, but there is a distinction. And this is why you see the commander, verse 29, immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman and because he had bound him. So, Paul's citizenship, he was born a citizen of Rome. That fact, not only, it would certainly have still been enough had Paul purchased it. But the fact that he was born one, again, this goes back to the attitude or the mindset, if not even the actual law of the Romans, that spoke to adhering to Roman law when it came to their citizens. Even by binding Paul, that was a transgression, so to speak, under Roman law because of the way Roman citizens were to be treated. Okay, now certainly, fortunately, he didn't go any further with this before he found out. And he immediately released him because he was concerned about, well, I say released him from his bindings. Those who were about to examine him withdrew. Okay, so you have the commander, you have the centurion, but then you would have had your average grunts, I guess, your regular soldiers who were going to do the dirty work. Okay, they were going to be doing the scourging. They take off. Nope, I'm done. And so they exit. They don't want to be associated with this whatsoever. And the commander was very afraid. Okay, this isn't good. We need to make sure we're very careful how we handle this. Anything through verse 29. Okay, so verse 28, what does that speak to regarding Paul's parenthood? At least one of his parents was a Roman citizen. Yeah, at least one of his parents. And there were specific rules in place regarding how exactly that worked. Kind of like how we have rules in place as to who's born a citizen versus who needs to apply for citizenship and so forth. But the Romans took it very, very seriously. And it is presumed, commonly thought, that Paul's father was perhaps the Roman citizen and his mother was the Jew, even if she purchased her citizenship between the fact that his dad would have been a Roman citizen and his mother, if she purchased her citizenship, Paul was then born a natural-born citizen of Rome. But it does speak to one or both of his parents having Roman citizenship, whether they bought it or they purchased it. And that's how Paul ended up being able to say he was born a citizen. Remember, he was in Tarsus. This is of the dispersion. And so, and again, the father's citizenship would have carried more weight. I don't know if we have any evidence to suggest or say that a woman's citizenship counted as much as the father's citizenship would have. That's why it's commonly thought that Paul's dad was, again, not to say he was a Jew per se, or not to say he wasn't a Jew per se, but it seems as though maybe he was a convert. Maybe Paul's dad was a proselyte and his mom was a Jew. Okay, but either way, Paul was born a Roman citizen. And that certainly gives an interesting angle, I guess you could say, on what relationship that Paul has later, or actually during this time. Who does Paul become very close to? He calls him a son in the faith. Timothy, yeah. Was Timothy also from not let's say a mixed heritage, but from a Gentile and Jew? Okay. Yeah, Greek. Yeah, his dad was a Greek, his mother was a Jew. All right, and so it kind of gives an interesting look at how Paul may have seen a lot of himself in Timothy and kind of took him under his wing as Gamaliel obviously took Paul under his. So it kind of gives you it's speculative, but in terms of how Paul saw the situation with him and Timothy, but he certainly saw him as a son. That's why he calls him his son in the faith. All right, anything through verse 29? All right, verse 30. So, the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews. So, the next day, because the commander wanted to know why Paul was being accused by the Jews, the commander released Paul from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set Paul before them. So, he calls the reigning authority, the highest authority in Judea according to Jewish law. Okay, I need to know what's going on here because the people are in an uproar. I can't, and of course by law he couldn't scourge Paul, although I'm sure Paul, he might have offered to try to explain it, but there was something about pushing an individual to tell the truth that would convince, for instance, the commander that he's actually speaking the truth. Paul could have said anything he wanted as far as the commander was concerned. But unless he's being having pressure put upon him, as in scourging, pain in some way, that was generally thought to produce accurate truth. Say what you will about it, that's how they did things. All right, so Paul, or the commander rather, I need to know what's going on. I imagine if I put Paul before the Sanhedrin, we're going to figure something out. And maybe the Sanhedrin will kind of be able to compose themselves rather than the people, because remember, the Sanhedrin should be more mature, should be able of controlling themselves a little bit better. You would think, I can finally get some answers because I can't ask the people because they go nuts. So that's the plan that he has. Anything through verse 30? Was it a sound plan from a Gentile perspective? You would think that this would be a solid plan, right? Does it turn out that way? No. The same thing we're going to see that happened earlier is going to happen in chapter 23. All right, so that ends Acts chapter 22. Let's look at our questions for Acts chapter 22. We already covered question 1. About the application to be drawn from what Ananias told Paul to do in verse 16, and of course, calling on the name of the Lord to be saved from Romans chapter 10 and verse 13. There is a process by which we call on the name of the Lord, which concludes with baptism for the remission of our sins. Question 2, what was it that caused the people to seek Paul's death? Yeah. And you could say that was the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, so to speak. It wasn't that they were happy with everything else that Paul said. We don't see any reaction. They allowed Paul to speak, and at least from that, they seemed to tolerate everything up until the mention of God sending a message to the Gentiles via Paul. Nope, we're done. Question 3, what is the significance of Paul having been born a Roman citizen compared to the commander who had purchased his citizenship? Yeah. Seems to have been higher recognition or attitude, status, as opposed to the commander who, because he purchased he was still a citizen, he was still allowed the luxuries of the liberties provided to citizens under the law, but because he purchased it, at the very least, the perception of one who purchases citizenship was different, lesser, so to speak. Question 4, why was the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen such a big deal to the commander and centurion? Yeah. Keep in mind, the commander and the centurion probably neither one of them were natural Romans anyway. Okay, we don't know anything about the centurion, but they had been basically drafted, it sounds like, as was the Roman army's prerogative and the way they did things. When they conquered a people, they took their army and incorporated it into their own, which was not a great idea, but that's how they did things. So the fact that this commander purchased his citizenship, it was probably more so for his advancement purpose and for the ability to gain those liberties provided to Roman citizens, those rights provided to Roman citizens. As a result of this, when he finds out that Paul's a citizen, born a citizen, and that they've already broken, to an extent, the law regarding having arrested him without an accusation. And that was the key component. Had there been an accusation, he could have bound him, but then he would have had due process. But the fact that the commander doesn't have anything to write down at this moment saying, here's what the accusation was, it was technically unlawful. Now, what will Lysias the commander do later when he sends Paul away to Caesarea? Yeah, he's going to send a letter. And in that letter, it's interesting how he phrases how everything that took place. I won't say he lied, but he certainly painted it in a slightly different light than what Luke tells us happened. So, and we'll cover that later. So, so they were in a position where, had they gone through with the scourging, they would have been in dire circumstances. And I don't know if we know the specifics of the Roman law, how that worked. If the punishment could have been the revoking of citizenship to those who had purchased it, okay, as opposed to those who were born. I don't know if that was revoked necessarily, but could citizenship that was purchased be taken away? I don't know, but that may have also been a fear of the commanders. All right, so anything through our questions for chapter 22? Yes, sir.
City and riot, soldiers doing what soldiers do, reacting by their training, force, quell the riot, take a prisoner, inflict punishment, whatever their training is. But the second part of it, Paul's reminding verse 25, when he asks this question about how you deal with a Roman and someone who's uncondemned. So you can check on the citizenship, background, whatever. But this other part, now he's, Captain seems to be going about, how can we get this guy condemned? So we can go back and continue what
Right.
we know to do.
And make sure that he's safe under the process that the Roman law provides. You know, I can't have him. That's why he releases him from his bonds before he takes him to the Sanhedrin, because technically there's nothing with which that he can accuse Paul. So by law, as a Roman citizen, he can't bind him. There is no accusation. There was a kerfuffle over this fella. We don't know exactly what it was, but Paul wasn't inciting a riot. He wasn't riling the people up on purpose. They simply were reacting to the things that he was saying, and Lysias didn't know why. All right, anything else to chapter 22? Chapter 23. So, Paul is now before the Sanhedrin. As far as we know, this is the first time Paul has been before the Sanhedrin as a whole since when? Yeah, since Acts chapter 8. As far as we know, when he received letters to go to Damascus and arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem. Okay? Because since that time, and Paul's been to Jerusalem several times since then, but as far as we know, Luke has never recorded anything. Paul never says anything else about him being before the Sanhedrin at any of those points. So, over the course of 20 years or so, at least, okay, you had 14 years between chapter 9 and chapter 13, and then you probably had at least another 4 or 5, so somewhere between 17 and 20 years. Is the makeup of the Sanhedrin going to be slightly different in terms of who's still alive? Yeah, okay. Some individuals, again, the Sanhedrin, these were going to be older fellows who had great knowledge of the law, highly respected. Again, the fact that we don't see Gamaliel at all here, he suggests one of two things. He converted and resigned his position as part of the Sanhedrin, or he was kicked out, one or the other, or he's passed away. I want to think and will assume the best that he did become a Christian before he passed away. I hope he did. And I would think that, given Paul being his protege, so to speak, that he would have paid particular attention, especially the way Gamaliel reacts back in Acts chapter 5. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Gamaliel doesn't appear to be here now. So there have been some changes since Paul was a part of the Sanhedrin. So there's going to be some interesting situations taking place. So starting in verse 1, Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" All right, so I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. So some kind of make a big deal about Paul saying until this day, as if something's changed. Is that what Paul's saying? That somehow he's offended his own conscience today?
A whole lot.
Unto. Some people make a big difference between until and unto. There was one time, years and years ago, I preached a sermon and I mentioned being faithful until death. And I had somebody, an older person, correct me, said, "No, it's unto death, not until death." And I didn't understand what the difference was. It's because some people make a big deal as until, as if there's a line that is crossed, that something's changed, versus unto, that is kind of through death, so to speak. But it's the same thing. Paul, he's not saying something's changed. He's saying, I've lived in all good conscience all the way till now. Okay? Which is to say, even when Paul was persecuting Christians, what did Paul think he was doing?
The right thing.
He thought he was following the law. Okay? He thought he was doing right. And even though when Jesus says it's hard for you to kick against the goats, okay, there may have been something in the back of his mind that, maybe I should look more into this. No, but the law says this. And, so whatever it was that Jesus was kind of telling Paul that Jesus knew about, something within Paul, something about Paul's efforts to persecute Christians, whatever it was, Paul was still in good conscience in doing what he did. Okay, there was no doubt as far as his service to the law regarding his righteousness of doing what he was doing. That being the case, why does the high priest Ananias command those who stood by him to strike Paul on the mouth? Why? Why? So maybe he called him a liar. Okay? Maybe that's the recognition. It's interesting because when you see what Paul says, I have lived in all good conscience before God. That doesn't mean that Paul was perfect under the law. Was anybody perfect under the law? Okay, there was one, right? All right, but aside from him, there was no one else. So Paul's not saying he was perfect, to which maybe the high priest would have been justified in at least correcting Paul by saying nobody's perfect under the law. But Paul says, I stand in good conscience. Whether he's addressing the aspect of his becoming a Christian, because that would incorporate his turning away from Judaism and then coming to Christ, and then from that point being a paragon, if you will, of what Christ wants from his people and so forth, being an example of the Christians teaching and converting Jews, even if it made them mad in other places. So whether it's including that or the fact that this may have indicated some sense of a lack of a clean conscience in Ananias. How dare you think you've got a clean conscience when we all have stuff that we know that we did things without the right motivations. And it could have been the way he was perceived. Paul was perceived in saying this. I have a clean conscience, but do all of you? Okay? I don't know that that's why Paul's saying this. I don't think that's why what he's implying by this, but that could very well have how Ananias took it. I think why Paul says this is, listen, all this is happening, I'm doing what God tells me to do. I was doing what I thought was right before, even though it wasn't. But everything I've done because I've been convinced that this is what God wants. So whether Ananias is seemingly righteous indignation in commanding this to be done, or it is in some way accusatory, or he perceives it to be accusatory towards him or the rest of the Sanhedrin, either way, he commands Paul to be slapped. Yes, sir?
I think two things kind of play. Perhaps a sense that he's picking up with the speech he was giving in chapter 22 when things went
south,
crazy
yeah.
wild. You know, as he was telling about his conversion, and God says, I'm sending you to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
So kind of picking up that train of thought. But even beyond that, as we've been studying throughout the book, throughout his travels, Jews are following him and laying charges against him, this, that, and the other. You know, he's all along, no, I'm doing
Yep.
what I'm supposed to be doing, what I've been told or commanded of God to do.
Yeah, you know, and that's interesting because that would also, if you consider the fact that the Sanhedrin, you would think, okay, a day has passed, not necessarily a full day, but from afternoon till the next morning or whenever this is, you would think that the Sanhedrin certainly would have known about everything that took place that day, and I'm sure they've had people come tell them what happened, okay, or what they saw happen or whatever. So it's interesting that Paul, as you say, if Paul was addressing the specific accusations that had been brought against him, how that he speaks against Moses and against the people and against this place, and he took a Gentile into the temple, Paul's statement of saying, I've lived in all good conscience, speaks to, at least from Paul, and Luke doesn't record that Paul went into details to what he meant by this, but it speaks to the fact that Paul did everything according to what he believed God was commanding him to do. Whether it was under the Mosaical law, as he was until Acts chapter 9, when he was not converted on the road to Damascus, when he was converted in Damascus, and then, now that he's a Christian, he continues to do everything God has told him to do. That being the case, this may be some sort of an effort to dissuade anyone from accusing him of deliberately doing something wrong or on purpose or doing things to rile people up or something like that. James?
If you look at this from the perspective of the high priest and the Sanhedrin council, this man is an apostate.
Yeah.
He has left the Jewish religion. He has left God, and now he's claiming that he's living in good conscience. This is a man who deserved death under the law of Moses.
Right?
And smite him on the mouth for saying such a thing.
Right. Right. And it's interesting because in verse 3, Paul, the way he responds suggests what about their lawful ability to hurt him? Whether it was punching him, slapping him, beating him, whatever it was. Did the law allow for that yet?
He's still uncondemned.
He's still uncondemned. So, and not just, it's interesting because I believe Paul's saying this on the basis of the Jewish law. Okay? Even under the Jewish law, he's still uncondemned. This was an examination, but he still wasn't even accused of anything yet. Okay? So even had he been accused, he's being examined by the Sanhedrin, there's still no excuse. There's still nothing provided under the law to punish him yet. It's not until that accusation is confirmed and he's sentenced. But then even under the Roman law, that's what's interesting. I don't know quite how that worked, how the Sanhedrin, they weren't above the Roman law, but technically they were beating a Roman citizen. Both the Jews earlier in chapter 21 and now the Sanhedrin. They're slap. And I don't think it was a light slap. It was. I tend to think it was either a punch or backhanded slap. Okay, it was something that hurt. All right? It was designed to do that. And so even from a Roman law perspective, they didn't have the right to do what they did. But what Paul says in verse 3, Paul's looking at this as the Jewish, because here's the Paul doesn't know Ananias is the high priest, and there's a whole background with that we'll probably have to get into next class. But Paul, recognizing the fact that this was told to be done, this is not according to what you should be doing. That's why he calls them a whitewashed wall. Similar to what Jesus, when he talked about the Pharisees and the scribes, when he says, you're whitewashed tombs. What does that mean?
Pretty on the outside.
Yeah, you present yourself as paragons of righteousness outwardly, but inwardly, you're not following God. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And again, of course, that relates directly to what they did, what was commanded to be done in that strike against Paul. But that may also have some sort of a bearing on their own motivations. Keep in mind that all throughout Acts, the Sanhedrin seemingly always acted in their own best interest and in the interest of preserving their authority. They didn't act in the interest of following God and always seeking the truth in matters. That a notable miracle has been done, we cannot deny, but let's sweep it under the rug and ignore it. Okay? This is their MO. Okay, now keep in mind that doesn't necessarily mean that every single individual on the Sanhedrin was like that. I hope Gamaliel, and the way he spoke, his maturity and his attitude, I hope Gamaliel wasn't one of those. I don't think he was, because I think Paul would have been like that. If he'd been taught and raised by Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was like that, Paul would have been like that. But they weren't. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 3 next week, and we'll talk about why it was Paul didn't know Ananias was the high priest in verse 5 is what Paul acknowledges. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.